Hello, welcome to the inaugural episode of Le Nouveau Esprit Presents. Our first series engages the question, what does the Church teach concerning the morality of recreational marijuana? Is recreational marijuana permissible or is it condemned? In this video, I will argue that the Church does in fact condemn recreational marijuana. Now, whenever there is a question concerning what Catholicism teaches, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is an excellent first place to begin. It is in fact has something to say about our topic. The Catechism teaches in paragraph 2291 the following. The use of drugs inflicts very grave damage on human health and life. Their use, except on strictly therapeutic grounds, is a grave offense. Clandestine production of and trafficking in drugs are scandalous practices. They constitute direct cooperation in evil, since they encourage people to practices gravely contrary to the moral law. So, drug usage is rejected because of the grave harm these substances inflict upon man and society. Drugs can only be licitly used therapeutically, which means for medical purposes alone. Any other usage is strictly immoral and is in fact a mortal sin. We hence obtain a first principle. It is immoral to use a substance which harms oneself. This principle has a caveat, namely that one can use a drug for medical purposes, but for medical purposes alone. Morphine, for example, is highly addictive, but still has a legitimate medical role in relieving pain for patients in extreme pain when other medicines have failed. Outside of medicinal purposes, the prohibition against drug usage is absolute. The Catechism therefore teaches this second principle, that the only time one can use a dangerous drug is within the limits of a justified medical treatment plan. We will note a third principle, that it is also immoral to produce or traffic illegal drugs. This paragraph orientates ourselves in understanding the Church's teachings about drugs, but it is brief and does not state what substances fall under its condemnation. The question as to whether alcohol and tobacco are condemned is also answered by the Catechism. The Catechism distinguishes both substances from drugs. Paragraph 2290 allows the use of tobacco and alcohol, provided that the virtue of temperance is observed. We read, quote, "The virtue of temperance disposes us to avoid every kind of excess. Those who abuse food, alcohol, tobacco, or medicine, or the abuse of food, alcohol, tobacco, or medicine, those who incur grave guilt, who by drunkenness or a love of speed endanger their own and others' safety on the road, at sea, or in the air." End quote. The Charter for Healthcare Workers likewise affirms the legitimacy of alcohol and tobacco use. The quotes within paragraph 97 are from an address of Pope John Paul II. The basic principle here is that alcohol and tobacco use are lawful unless abused. So you can use alcohol and tobacco but not abuse them. And now we're going to turn to the teachings of a third church document called Church, Drugs, and Drug Addiction, and I'm going to refer to it as CDDA. This document was issued by the Pontifical Council for Health Pastoral Care and presents the Church's most thorough teachings on drugs. CDDA teaches that, in general, drugs testify to a kind of contempt for life and represent a personal attempt of extricating oneself from reality and from the circumstances of human life. End quote. The usage of drugs is done in part out of a desire to supplement life, and this has the effects of destroying lives and relationships while also dimming the mind. Drugs also have an inner tendency to promote an individualism and egocentrism ordered towards self-isolation. Citing John Paul II, CDDA affirms that drugs take first place among the threats endangering the youth. Drugs are strictly identified with the culture of death, threatening to overtake the culture of life. Quote, using drugs is anti-life, end quote. Drug dealers are worse than slave dealers according to the Pope because while slave owners deprive man of his dignity, the drug dealer leads his or her victims to the destruction of their personality and personhood. The atmosphere out of which drugs become appealing is permeated by religious skepticism, hedonism, and an existential void colored with violence and a sense of purposelessness of life itself. Drugs seek to fill the spiritual void. Drug abuse represents a world permeated with nihilism. It is out of nihilism that man finds motivators for his turn to drugs. Now, drugs destroy the personality of the user. Quote, what people seek in drugs is the endless perversion of human aspiration, the pseudo-ecstasy of a world that does not believe, but all the same cannot shake off its shoulders the tension of the soul towards paradise. End quote. The problem is not with drugs themselves, but the spiritual diseases motivating the person to abuse drugs in the first place. Drug usage is the existential appropriation of nihilism turned against oneself in the attempt to annihilate one's existence. Quote, in effect, the problem is not in the drug, but in the sickness of the spirit that leads to drugs. As Pope John Paul II reminds us, there is need to recognize that there is a link between the lethal sickness caused by the abuse of drugs and the sickness of the spirit that leads a person to escape from oneself and seek deceptive satisfactions and avoiding reality to the point of canceling completely the meaning of one's existence. End quote. CDDA therefore teaches that, quote, there is a need to totally reject the use of drugs. End quote. Following John Paul II, drug dealers are defined as, quote, merchants of death, end quote. The moral argument against drug usage is that by using these substances, man commits an unjustified and irrational act of renunciation of his vocation to be a person. For this action is a renunciation of thinking, willing, and acting as free persons. This has two consequences. First, one does not have a right or freedom to do drugs. There is no such thing as a freedom to consume drugs for two reasons: that no one has a right to harm himself, and that no one has a right to abdicate one's personal dignity. The second consequence is this: the Church condemns both the liberalization and legalization of drugs. Quote, drugs are an evil, and you do not make concessions to an evil, end quote. Now, CDDA rejects the distinction between soft and hard drugs repeatedly. Cannabis is specifically mentioned by CDDA as a drug some would consider to be soft, but argues that cannabis cannot be a soft drug due to the serious health consequences it has for its users, concluding that, quote, considering all the facts, it is irresponsible to consider cannabis in a trivial way and to think of it as being a soft drug. That is one without remarkable effects on the organism, end quote. In the mind of the Pontifical Council, cannabis is in the same category of substances with the same level of danger as cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, LSD, and crack. In rejecting the distinction of cannabis as a soft drug, this church document placed marijuana in the same category as heroin and cocaine. It should hence come as no surprise then that the legalization of marijuana is condemned. Drug advocates want to describe marijuana as a soft drug, but CDDA warns that this would create mass confusion in society and trivialize cannabis in public opinion, masking cannabis's real physiological and spiritual dangers. CDDA gave an extensive summary of the health effects of cannabis on a human person for a justification as to why cannabis cannot be a soft drug and requires the same condemnation as hard drugs, and here is a summarized list. So, paragraph 103 lists the following health effects. When there's a light dosage, we have slight euphoria, sense of satisfaction, desire to laugh, and light drowsiness. Strong dosage has the effects of difficulty executing actions, upset of time perception, visual precision, and immediate memory, and lethargy. Dangerous when operating machinery or vehicles. Paragraph 104 notes that there is an increased cardiac rhythm, decreased salivation, swelling of blood vessels, nausea, similar risk to smoking tobacco, concentration and learning difficulties, excessive worry about obtaining cannabis. Paragraph 105 notes that in more fragile individuals, cannabis can trigger hallucinations and hallucinatory phenomenon, schizophrenia, paranoia, anxiety, serious psychic disorder, and panic crises. Paragraph 106 states that repeated use leads to psychic dependence of medium to high level. Paragraph 107 notes that THC causes disorders in sensorial, visual, auditory, spatial, and temporal perceptions. Alright. And now we also want to note that smoking marijuana is always immoral. So one cannot smoke marijuana except for medical purposes, since any other reason is condemned by paragraph 2291 of the Catechism. But there is not a legitimate medical reason to smoke marijuana. Therefore, it is immoral to smoke marijuana regardless, or absolutely. And here's the reasons why there are no legitimate medical reasons for smoking marijuana. 1. Several medical professional societies are against smoking marijuana for medical purposes, and this includes the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Glaucoma Research Foundation, and the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Second, marijuana smoke contains several toxic chemicals like ammonia, benzene, toluene, and naphthalene. Third, smoking marijuana is impractical as a drug delivery system because one cannot properly measure dosages. And lastly, marijuana smoke causes several respiratory problems, and research suggests that this will include chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which causes irreversible lung damage. Alright, so to summarize, the Catholic Church rejects any moral legitimacy to recreational marijuana. Cannabis falls under the moral condemnation of drugs in the Catechism, paragraph 2291. Marijuana has serious side effects, so it cannot be considered lightly or treated as a soft drug. Doing so trivializes a substance that is in reality extremely dangerous to use. All drugs are immoral to use for non-therapeutic purposes because such usage is an abandonment of one's calling to be a person. Persons are endowed with the faculties of free will and rationality. These are two of man's deepest goods and values as a free person that drugs pervert. Drugs substitute man's fulfillment as a person found in seeking out a healthy life through relationships, work, and hobbies by replacing it with a chemical satisfaction and dependence. One cannot defend a right to use drugs because man does not have a right to abdicate his metaphysical status as a created person and the demand this places upon himself to fulfill this calling. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the contents of this video and want to dive deeper, you can find more information about this material on our website. This video corresponds to part 1 of 5 of a whole series of articles dedicated to the question of Catholicism, drugs, and marijuana, and this slide has some of the relevant links. And we'll have those links in the video description below as well. If you wish to support us, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our mailing list, and consider making a donation. We accept PayPal donations on our website and have a Patreon page where you can support us monthly and access special perks. Financial contributions go towards maintaining our website and the purchase of required texts for our research. If you are interested in learning more about the health effects of marijuana, check out the next video in our series. Thank you.